Now we're going to look at Aristotle, who was Plato's student, just as Plato was Socrates' student. Aristotle spent most of his life in Plato's academy, only leaving to start his own school called the Lyceum after Plato's death. A good way of understanding the relationship between Plato and Aristotle is that Plato was by nature a mathematician. Supposedly, over the door of the academy was inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of mathematics enter here." If you would have visited the Academy of Plato on Bill and Ted's Great Adventure Time Machine, instead of finding Plato discussing philosophy, you most likely would have found him bent over the dirt looking at mathematical or geometrical figures and doing mathematics. Aristotle, on the other hand, was by nature a physical scientist. He was more interested in the types of order and structure that exist in this world. He is responsible for writing the first organized treatise in most scientific subject matters. You'll find Aristotle mentioned in the first chapter of psychology books, of physics books, of biology books, and chemistry books, because he wrote the first organized treatises on biology, on meteorology, on psychology, on the weather, on astronomy, and on physics. You may know the story that Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle's in his youth, and when he went off to conquer the world, he would send back specimens of rare animals from all of the places he conquered, because he knew that his old teacher would be interested in them. So if you had visited Aristotle's Lyceum on any random day, you'd be likely to find him bent over a specimen or dissecting a weird animal that he had found. Whereas Plato was interested in the perfect form that existed in another world, Aristotle was interested in the type of ordered and structured change that went on within a biological organism. So Aristotle's going to come up with a different theory of how permanence and change are possible. One that finds the origin of permanence not in another world apart from this one, but in this world. Aristotle criticized Plato's theories by suggesting that the world of forms was too different and too far away to explain how things were permanent in this world. Whatever the principle of permanence or principle of order that was in a material object, like a living organism, that made it grow and move, it must be something that was present in this world. So instead of separating form and matter into two different worlds, as Plato did, Aristotle separates each object into two different aspects. Plato's theories are sometimes called a dualistic theory, splitting reality up into two worlds or two types of things, whereas Aristotle's theories are called a dual aspect theory. So if we look at a table, there aren't two tables there, one in the world of forms and one in this world. Instead, we would say that the table has two different aspects. It has matter, the wood that it's made of, the material out of which it's composed, and then that wood is arranged in a different way. If I took a sledgehammer and busted up the table, the wood would still be there, but it would no longer be a table. It would have lost the form. And you can take that matter and reform it in many different ways. So when we know a thing, it's the form or the arrangement of that thing that makes them what they are. Aristotle believed that there was a single type of basic matter out of which everything was composed that he called prime matter. He didn't know about the chemical structure or atoms the way that we do, but he thought that there had to be some prime matter out of which everything was arranged. So in many ways, Aristotle's theory is easier to understand because it forms the basis for the basic chemical and atomic theory that forms the basis of modern understanding of matter. So change is very easy to explain for Aristotle. You have a composite of form and matter. We've imagined we have 6 marbles arranged in this triangular arrangement. We can rearrange those very same matter, into a rectangle. And when change occurs, the form changes, the arrangement changes, but the matter remains the same. So change is just the rearrangement of matter, or when matter takes on new forms. So change is very easy to explain for Aristotle. It's just the rearrangement of matter. But we're going to discover that permanence will be much more difficult to explain, because what you might be tempted to say when you try to explain permanence, since the form is changing and the matter remains, you might be tempted to say, well, maybe matter is the source of permanence for Aristotle. But that would be a mistake. Hopefully none of you on the exam will say that Aristotle gets permanence from matter. It should be obvious why that's the case. First of all, you remain the same person, the same organism from the time that you're a baby till you grow, and now you have much more matter than you did as a child. And scientists tell us that every 7 or 8 years, all of the atoms and molecules that make up our body are changed over for new atoms and molecules. So you don't have any of the same actual atoms in you that you did when you were a child. In the course of regular cellular metabolism, we change over all of our matter. So it's not our matter that makes us what we are. All of us are like the fabled ship of Theseus, a ship that had traveled and been in service so long that a mast was replaced first, and then a decking, and then this board, and then this rigging, until there were no original parts left, just like somebody who has an old Model T Ford and has eventually, over time, replaced every single part in it. We would say that it was still the same ship, or still the same car. So it isn't the matter of a thing that makes it what it is. It isn't your matter that makes you the same person, or that makes an organism the organism that it is. It's the form or the arrangement of that. Yet it seems that change and our arrangement of our matter is constantly changing, at least in some ways. Since change comes from the rearrangement of matter, you'll see that Aristotle is going to have a problem explaining how form can be both the source of change and the source of permanence. And the solution to that problem is, of course, going to be that there are different types of form present in an object, different levels of form. So if we go back to our table made out of wood, we recognize that there's lots of different levels of form there. There's the arrangement of the wood into the table, but wood has a form as well. It's the arrangement of cellulose cells, the cell walls of various different cells, to make a particular type of substance called wood. And cellulose is a particular arrangement of molecules to make cellulose. And those molecules are particular arrangements of atoms. And those atoms are particular arrangements of protons and neutrons and electrons. So there are different types of form and matter in a thing, and one might change while other aspects of the form remain the same. Aristotle thought that our soul was the form of a living thing. It was the arrangement of our matter that gives us the distinctive powers of life. If you wanted to study the soul for Aristotle, you wouldn't go to the philosophy department or to the theology department. You would go to the biology department. The soul is the organization of our matter that gives us the powers of life. So things like the Krebs cycle and the organization of our circulatory system are aspects of our soul, according to Aristotle. And he saw that there were different levels of soul, different types of form. You don't need to know all of these 5 basic levels of soul that Aristotle identified, but they give you the idea that there are lots of different levels of soul and that one might change while the other remains the same. There was the nutritive or the vegetative soul, which is the organization of our body that gives us the power of metabolism and growth and reproduction. That would be our DNA and the metabolism of our cells, the Krebs cycle and things like that. That gives us the powers of life. That's why they call a person who has lost their brain function a vegetable, not because they resemble a carrot, but because they still have this nutritive or vegetative level of soul or biological organization, which gives them the basic powers of life. Aristotle thought there was also an appetitive soul, which was the ability to move. They saw that some animals, like sponges, just sit there, and other animals have the ability to initiate action. So the appetitive soul would be something like our nervous system. The sensory soul would be the organization of our body that gives us the ability to sense things, our nervous system and our sense organs. Our locomotive soul is not a choo-choo train. Locomotion is the ability to move. So the locomotive soul would be the organization of our body that would give us the powers of motion. Can you think of what that would be? Our skeleton or our muscular system, and maybe our parts of our nervous system involved in coordinating it. Maybe you read the book Flat Stanley in grade school, where somebody doesn't have a skeletal system and they just sit like a blob. But Aristotle also introduced the idea of defining a thing by its genus and species, a general form that it possessed and shared with other creatures, and then its specific difference. And he gave a very famous definition of a human being as a rational animal. So we share with other animals these aspects of our organization that give us the powers of life, but we have a special soul, a special part of our soul, a special organization, which is the ability to reason that we'll talk about later. But you'll probably recognize these different types of soul as the different types of circulatory systems and skeletal system and reproductive system, the different biological systems that you learned in your anatomy or biology class. So let's go back to our problem of how form can be both the source of permanence and of change. Now we have a way of solving the problem. We know that matter isn't the solution. Even though matter stays the same, everything has the same prime matter, so that can't be what makes it what it is. And matter is always changing as we lose some and have it interchanged with other bits of atoms and molecules. So part of the form can change. We call the part of the form that can change while we remain the same person the accidental form. It's accidental to what makes the person what it is. But we think that there's another type of our form, another level of form, that is essential to who we are, and that form must remain the same. So change comes from one part of the form, the accidental form changing, whereas permanence is going to come from the essential form of a thing remaining the same as that thing changes. So remember Aristotle's prime example that he wants to explain would be the growth and development of an organism, from an acorn to a sapling to a young tree to finally a completed and fully actualized oak tree. As we go through these changes, the accidental form of this thing will change, but there's some part of its form which remains the same from stage to stage. That part of the form that remains the same is called the essential form. Aristotle's big idea was that all change is the actualization of a potential. The oak tree, the final perfected oak tree, was called the thing's end or goal. The Greek word telos, T-E-L-O-S, was used to describe that. And Aristotle thought that all of nature was teleological. Nowadays, scientists would think that there is no end or purpose or goal or desire involved in nature. Things just follow physical law. But Aristotle thought that there were purposes built into the very structure of an object. And this wasn't a theological or a religious belief. This was a scientific belief. He thought that there was something about change that required that there was more to the essential form than just a bit of a lump of form that remained the same. So if you were building Legos, for example, you might build a Lego castle. And when you were done with it, you might tear or rearrange part of it, but leave like the corner the same. And as the thing changed, you could always go back and find the one little aspect of its organization, the corner that was always the same. But Aristotle saw that that's not what essential form is, that the change involved in growth and development of an organism is not just a lump that sits there. There's some guiding principle that organizes how a thing acts. So Aristotle thought that there had to be something in an essential form that worked in a way that we might regard as magical. Somehow, the essential form of the acorn knows what it is. It already knows how to guide the development of the acorn so that it puts the leaves in the right place and makes the leaves into the distinctive pattern of an oak leaf instead of a beech leaf or a maple leaf. There's something that guides and moves or impels that change. We can tell that the acorn really wants to be an oak tree. If it falls into the crack in a sidewalk and sprouts, and we run it over it with our bike, and somebody pours, Roundup or something onto it that prevents its growth, we see how it repairs the damage and resists attempts to destroy it, and continues to try to grow and achieve that telos, that end or purpose of growing into an oak tree. So Aristotle thought that there must be something else in the essential form that somehow contains information about what that thing is and gives it an ability to guide and impel that change so that the change and growth of the acorn is directed and purposive. Now we know, for example, that our DNA remains the same as we grow, and it somehow contains information. But Aristotle would have disagreed even with that. He thought that there had to be something else that wasn't purely mechanical, that contained the idea or the telos of that thing, and that actively pushed or impelled or guided it in some type of purposive change. And this is still in some ways a mystery to modern biology. DNA codes for proteins, and those proteins get turned out by the cells, and yet somehow they glom together to each other and produce in the embryo the differentiation of the various different cells and the production of an organized biological body. We understand many of those things, but it's still somewhat of a mystery how the various different proteins come together to make precisely the type of organism that it is. So we can't blame Aristotle too much for hypothesizing this magical or purposive essential form and the way in which it works. So far, we don't really have the full explanation of permanence. If I ask you on the exam, how does Aristotle explain permanence? You have to say more than essential form is a part of the form that remains the same, whereas the accidental form changes. We have to somehow figure out how it can perform these two other important purposes. It has to somehow determine the thing's telos, or end, or goal, and it has to actively have some power to guide and impel the change. We have to see how Aristotle thought he could explain how a thing gets this organic unity, how a thing becomes a substance through the operation of this essential form. And to do so, it's going to turn out that we'll have to understand more than just what's going on in the acorn. It's going to turn out that we're going to have to understand a mysterious three-part equation between the form, the essential form of the acorn that exists, ideas in our mind, in human reason, that specific difference of us that defines human beings as a rational animal, and then God. So a substance or an object for Aristotle had an essential form, and that essential form performed those two important goals of determining its telos and guiding and impelling the thing towards its change. And to understand exactly how that works, we're going to have to take a detour into Aristotle's cosmology, his view of the structure of the universe, and his views of God and of human reason. But the basic idea might be easier to understand because Aristotle took as his guiding metaphor, his guiding principle, our very intimate knowledge of how a form of a thing is capable of determining a telos or a purpose and then guiding and impelling that change. When we, in our soul, feel a desire for something, if you're hungry, into your mind may pop the idea of a nice juicy hamburger from the coffee shop. And the more we think about it, the more we desire it, and we feel it sort of guiding and impelling us. So we feel it pulling us off the couch, to head out to the coffee shop to get that hamburger. So Aristotle is going to take as a metaphor for how all forms in nature work, the way desire works in us. So Aristotle famously said that all things move towards their telos, all things move towards their final goal, just as a lover is moved towards its beloved. For Aristotle, love or purposiveness or desire literally makes the world go round. And again, in the absence of the detailed knowledge that we have, you can't blame Aristotle too much for using this clear metaphor as a guide for how other natures in the physical world act, since we have such a clear example of how our nature works in our mind in the case of desire. So we're going to see if we can use that hint to see how there's an equation between our mind and our desire and ideas that pop into our mind, the mind of God, and form in nature. And to see just how seriously Aristotle took this, you don't need to know the details of Aristotle's theory of physical nature, but it may help you understand just exactly how purposive he thought physical reality was and how it was related to God. It may help to understand Aristotle's view of the structure of reality. On the terrestrial realm, this is a picture of Earth, there were 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And each of them was the simplest type of form or organization. So they had as their goal not becoming a particular type of thing, like a squirrel or an oak tree or a maple tree. Their telos or goal was just to get to a certain place. To get to the center of the earth was the goal of Earth. So the Earth, the planet, was in the center of the universe. Not because the Earth is special, but because it's made of rocky stuff, and all the rocky stuff congregated in its natural place, the center of the Earth. In fact, the center of the Earth was not a good place. It was the dark corner of the world furthest away from God. So for Aristotle, not at all a special place. And then around the Earth was a sphere of water. So that rock would fall down through the sphere of water towards the center of the Earth. And above that was another sphere of air. And that's why bubbles would rise up through the water towards its natural place. And then highest up would be the sphere of fire. And that's why fire or smoke would rise up through water and through air to get to its natural place up above the Earth. So you had the Earth in the center. You had the sphere of water, the sphere of air, and the sphere of fire. And the movements of all objects were explained by their desire to get to their natural place. Heavy things had lots of earth in them. Lead, for example, had lots of earth, maybe only a little bit of water or air in them, whereas cotton or clouds would have lots of air and maybe just a little bit of water or earth mixed in with them. Outside of that terrestrial realm, where everything was moved by the 4 elements to move towards its natural place, there were spheres for each of the different planets. Aristotle only knew of the 7 the planets: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And they moved in a circle around the Earth, just like the Sun traveling an entire circle around the Earth in 24 hours. Each of the other planets moved in a circle as well, in taking different times to rotate all the way around. And at the end, or the outer limits of that, there was the firmament of the stars, where the stars were fixed. Planets moved in the heavens where the stars kept their same orientations or constellations. And they were all moving around as well. And outside of this. As you move outward, you're getting closer to God. Outside of God is the Empyrean, which you can see here, which in which dwell God and all of the saints. So God existed outside of the universe, and was in some way the engine that was causing all of the universe to move. That's the first definition of God we're going to learn. On the exam, I'll ask you about the 3 definitions of God that Aristotle gave as part of his solution to permanence. The first one is that God is the unmoved mover. God is moving the firmament of the stars to rotate, and that movement sort of rubs off on the other spheres and causes them to move. And then all of the motion on Earth ultimately comes from this circular motion of the heavens. The realm at which the spheres rub against the realm of fire is called the meteorological realm. Meteors were thought to be bits of this fifth element, the ether, the perfect crystalline substance out of which the heavens were made, onto this world. And of course, if there were no external source of motion, eventually fire and air and earth and water would separate to their natural places and just sit there after they'd reached their natural place. So all of the motion on Earth comes from the stirring up of the terrestrial realm by the motion of the heavens in the meteorological realm. You may wonder, why is weather called meteorology? Why would they think that weather has anything to do with meteors? Well, because the weather was caused by this borderline realm where the motion of the heavens rubbed into the terrestrial realm and caused the circulation of air and water and fire, which caused the weather. So the structure of the universe for Aristotle was a purposive structure, because it's going to turn out that God is not pushing the universe. He's not the unmoved mover in the way that you may think. He's the source of all the motion of the universe, yet nothing moves him. That's the meaning of unmoved mover. He moves everything else, but nothing moves him. But God isn't out there like on a stationary bicycle pumping away to make the world go around. He isn't like a hamster on a wheel pushing those things. He's moving the world in a different way. In fact, the meaning of unmoved mover has more to do with love. Think of Plato, that the beloved was the more perfect and the lover was the imperfect, that desired the goodness or fullness of the thing that it loved. So God is so beautiful and so full of being that everything else is moved out of love and admiration to imitate him, yet he himself is not moved to love or desire anything else, since he already is completely actual, already contains all that he needs to contain. So this is sort of a cutout picture of the structure of the universe. And now we can see that the movement up towards the heavens, towards God, is also a movement towards the different gradations of being. Sometimes this was called the great chain of being. So God is out there in the heavens doing what he does. And it turns out that what God does is thought thinking itself. That's the second definition of God you'll need to know. God is thought thinking itself. Instead of having a separate world of forms, as Plato did, Aristotle just has God outside of the universe. And God is thinking his thoughts. Instead of forms, we have ideas in the mind of God. And what is God doing with those ideas? Again, Aristotle disagreed with Plato and said these forms just don't sit here as permanent, unmovable, transcendent objects. For Aristotle, God had to be continually thinking these things, whereas Plato sort of had a CD collection that was just sitting on the shelf, static and unmoving, just sitting there as perfect models. For Aristotle, God had to be continually playing all of those CDs, and that playing was God circularly thinking over those things again and again, playing them over and over again in his mind. So God thinking as thought thinking himself is the mind of God continually playing over and over again these many ideas or thoughts. Because he was continually playing them over, a common metaphor was that he was singing a song or playing some type of music. And they even talked about the harmony or the music of the spheres, because what made the world go round is that just as when you hear a nice tune that you like, you start tapping your foot along with it and start sort of bopping and moving in imitation and love and desire of that beautiful music. So the heavens, the stars and the planets, sort of received the transmission or heard the song or the music of God's thought thinking itself. And their movement wasn't physically pushed or moved by God. It was purposively or out of love or desire moved out of imitation and love. So they heard the transmission of God singing to himself, the different forms of the different types of reality. God is like a great radio station who's continually playing the top 50 hits of being, or the top 100 hits of reality. He's continually singing to himself the perfect horse song, or the perfect dog song, or the perfect human body song, the perfect tree song, and the perfect rock song. And when all the objects in the world hear that singing, they move and dance in response to that beautiful music, being moved out of admiration and love to move in response. So, as I said, these things form a great chain of being as you get closer to God. Here at the very center of the earth, this is actually a picture of the devil in the center of the earth, the worst things. And then here are the four elements responding in simple ways. Then you have plants, and then lower animals and higher animals. You have human beings, and then the various different choirs of angels, and all moving towards God as the ultimate source of the beauty and order that he's singing. So God's thought thinking itself is this third definition of God as pure form, pure actuality, or pure telos. Form is actuality, whereas matter is potentiality. If you got sand on a beach, it's not actually anything. It's potentially lots of things. You could build lots of different things, making your sandcastle in different ways by rearranging the sand. But as you impose form on it, it becomes actually one thing. But God is the final actualization of all potential. He already is all that he can be. He is purely actual, no longer has any potential. So God is just these pure forms. They don't exist in some separate realm like Plato did, but they exist in the mind of God as these ideal forms, ideal oak tree song, ideal rock song, ideal squirrel song. And now we get from the three parts of God. God is pure ideals or pure forms existing without matter. He's continually singing or thinking them to himself in this circular manner, continually transmitting the top 100 hits of being throughout the universe. And in doing so, he's the unmoved mover. He's moving everything to grow and strive towards him, while himself being unmoved. The tree is trying to be the best little tree it can be. The animal, the best little worm and the best little chimpanzee it can be. Each human being, the best little thing they can be. The angels being the best that they can be. All striving to actualize those forms that are being sung in their most perfect form by God's thought thinking itself. So now we can finally understand how an essential form works to determine a thing's telos and to guide and impel that change. We finally are getting to the first part of our equation, that form in nature is like a one-channel God receiver. You know, the radio in your car has a dial that you can get lots of different channels. But imagine you had a radio that could only pull in one channel. The acorn just gets the oak tree channel, just gets God singing the oak tree song again and again and again, over and over. 24/7, it just gets the oak tree song. And when it tunes into that song, it starts tapping along with it, just like the heavens tap along with the harmony or the music of the spheres. And it grows and develops out of love and desire to actualize the perfect song that it hears God singing through this transmission. So that's how the essential form knows what it is. It tunes into the perfect oak tree song that's being sung by God, and what guides and impels it towards its purpose to become more and more like God is love or admiration. Literally, all things move towards their telos as a lover moves towards its beloved. So the oak tree develops, the acorn develops into an oak tree out of love of God, or love of the beautiful form that exists as thought thinking itself in the mind of God. So God is transmitting all of the thought thinking itself, all of the pure forms of things. And each essential form is a particular receiver that gets that one channel. Our body gets the human body channel 24/7 and grows and develops in accordance with that. We may wonder, why are all things different then? Why is there variation in human beings? This will be very important when we talk about gender. Aristotle will be the dominant view in Western culture of reality through most of the Middle Ages, and most religious parts of Christianity will be profoundly influenced by Aristotle. So when we think of gender, when we think of what's natural in terms of sexuality and in terms of what makes a person what they are, they'll be influenced by Aristotle. So if we want to think, why am I different than you? Why are human beings all slightly different? Think in terms of this transmission. If there's something wrong with your antenna, or if you're going through a tunnel, or if there's some interference, then the way you get the signal will be different than how I get the signal. We'll literally be marching to the beat of a different drummer. We'll hear slightly different versions of the song. But on that view, difference or diversity is a type of imperfection. It's a type of deviation or deviance from the perfect song. If we were all getting the signal loud and clear, then we would all be have the same perfect model, like Michelangelo's David. So the great chain of being gets to more and more perfect beings depending on how loud and clear and how much of the signal that each creature gets. Now we have to get to the last part of the equation, which is human reason, which is going to turn out to be tied into the individual nature of organisms, and also to the mind of God that's transmitting these. Whereas our body only gets one channel, the human body channel. Human reason, Aristotle called the tool of tools, the organon of organons. The word organ means tool. We can get in any channel. When we think using our mind, we can not only get in our body, but we can think of the form that makes up a cell. We can think of a squirrel. We can think of a flower. We can think of a tree. And when we do that, Aristotle thought that we were capable of separating the form from the matter. We use our senses to sort of tune in, to tune our receiver into the transmission that was coming from God. And when we do that through what Aristotle called theory, or study, we would call it meditation or contemplation. When we apprehend that form in itself in our mind, we are feeling the very same transmission that the squirrel feels or the oak tree feels. And we can feel the purposiveness, the love or the desire moving that object. The energy moves our thought in the same way that it moves the actual object. So human reason tunes directly into the transmission from God and participates in and enjoys that thought thinking itself, which is what is directing the squirrel and the oak tree to become what they are. So you may wonder, how is it in fiction? You can have characters that are so lifelike, that appear to have a life of their own. Or you can tell stories of Peter Rabbit, of bunnies, or of birds that appear to be very lifelike. Aristotle would say that's because we're tuning in to the bird form, or the squirrel form, or the person form, and those things are moved by the same energy or magic that moves the nature of a thing, getting that transmission. But this was important for Aristotle because he thought, in some sense, the highest form of human happiness was study or contemplation. This should remind you of Joseph Pieper your Conversatio studies. They're taking this from Aristotle, thinking that leisure, the ability to not do things, but to just sit there and enjoy and contemplate experiences, is the highest form of human activity. Because when you do so, you're no longer in yourself. You're tuning in directly to the mind of God. And when you do so, just like you're tuning into the cable station, you're tuning into Netflix. If your TV dies or gets broken down, that little experience that you had when you tuned into that movie is still there on the Netflix server. So at every moment that you tune into or contemplate, when you enjoy the beauty of a piece of music, when you enjoy the feeling, just the feeling of your bare feet on dewy grass in the morning, when you enjoy the form and structure and color of flowers as you're staring at them, even when you understand mathematics or looking at the structure of a cell in biology, whenever you just contemplate, not to use, but just to experience anything and any experience, that experience will continue to exist in the mind of God even when you're dead. It'll still exist on the central server. And to that degree, that part of you is immortal. That part of you gains identity with God. You can think of it as like an eternal moment. At that moment, what you experience at that instant will always be there, even after your death, after the death of your particular identity. So Aristotle would say every moment in which you've ever been happy, in which you've ever been overcome by joy or love, has always been a case when you forgot about external things and just enjoyed this particular form, this particular experience, this particular sensation, and lost yourself in it. And Aristotle thinks that those experiences, like that book, remember, that you could look at that was so engrossing that you could never look away, in this case, those experiences are tuning in to a reality beyond yourself, and those moments of identity with that reality are eternal. They will exist and be immortal even when your particular body and the particular receiver that integrates and controls your body no longer exists. So reason and the operation of reason in contemplation and leisure, as Pieper thought, is the highest human activity because it's how we get immortality. It's how we gain some type of unity with God. So Aristotle explains permanence and change by having form and matter. Form is the arrangement of matter, and matter remains the same as form changes. But permanence comes from an essential form, which, unlike the accidental form, remains the same and guides and impels the change and development of an organism. And it does that only because of the three definitions of God. The form in nature tunes in to God's thought thinking itself, which are the pure forms of the perfect acorn song or the perfect squirrel song. And then it moves it out of love and desire, just as love and desire moves the entire universe. And then human reason is capable of tuning in to those transmissions. And in virtue of that, it's capable of having these eternal moments that give human nature a type of immortality.